So in the last video where we left off was talking about electron carriers. So to recap, one of the first reactions that happens in photosynthesis is the sunlight hits the chlorophyll that's located in the thylakoid. And what happens when the sunlight hits the chlorophyll is it starts to charge up these electrons, and the electrons become excited. What these electrons need now is to be carried to a different part of this photosynthesis reaction, and that's done through this NADP+. Remember that when NADP+ is carrying these two electrons, it turns into NADPH. So NADPH is going to carry these electrons to a different part of the chloroplast so that those electrons can be used in a different part of photosynthesis. So here's the entire photosynthesis reaction. What you have is sunlight coming in, and this is a picture of the thylakoid. You have sunlight coming in and you have water coming in. During this light reaction, NADP+ takes the electrons that are excited by the thylakoid, or by the sunlight, turns that into NADPH, and it's going to take those to the Calvin cycle. Okay, we also have this water that's being turned into oxygen, and the H, the hydrogen from water, is where it gets connected for this NADPH. So you've got sunlight coming in, you've got water coming in. Then when we go over to the Calvin cycle, we have carbon dioxide coming in, and that carbon dioxide is going to be converted into part of that glucose molecule that we saw earlier. Out of the Calvin cycle, it recycles that NADP+, and it also gives off ADP. ADP in this phosphate group is put together to make ATP. So we have ATP, which is our chemical form of energy, is also produced during this light dependent. When water is broken down to take those electrons that are excited that we attach to the NADP+, we get these hydrogen ions left out there. These ions move through a protein channel outside of the cell. Okay, this is going to be your facilitated diffusion. This protein has a specific name. It's called ATP synthase. As these hydrogen ions pass through ATP synthase, they convert ADP to ATP. ATP, remember, is energy. How this works is you have your hydrogen ions here. They need to leave this area, so they pass through this ATP synthase. As the hydrogen ion passes through this protein, what happens is it's kind of like a mill where this ADP, for every hydrogen ion that's pumped out, ADP is connected to a phosphate. This is adenosine diphosphate, meaning there's two phosphate groups. It connects it to this extra phosphate to make adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So ATP synthase, by pumping hydrogens through it, makes ATP. The light-independent reaction is also known as the Calvin cycle. It takes the ATP and the NADPH formed from the light-dependent reactions in the thylakoids, but these aren't very stable. They can only hold that energy for a little bit. So during the Calvin cycle, they use that energy and those electrons to build the high-energy compounds, which is glucose. So we get 6 carbon dioxide molecules into the Calvin cycle. Where does this plant get the carbon dioxide? Well, it gets it from the atmosphere. Every time you take a breath in, you're breathing in oxygen. When you breathe out, one of the waste products is carbon dioxide. Through the reactions in the Calvin cycle, ATP and NADPH are going to provide energy to take those carbon dioxide building blocks and turn it into glucose. Remember that ATP and NADPH from the Calvin cycle, that's working in the Calvin cycle, came from those light-dependent reactions. This is a very blurry picture of the Calvin cycle. What you need to understand here, you're not going to have to memorize this whole thing. You need to know that 3 carbon dioxides come in, through all of these reactions. You can see at this point in this reaction, here we're using our ATP. Here we're using our NADPH and turning that back to NADP+. Here we're using some more ATP. So in those light dependent reactions, we have to have that hydrogen move through the ATP synthase to make ATP so that we can use this energy to power this Calvin cycle. Carbon dioxide comes in and glucose comes out. Photosynthesis provides us with food. Food provides living things like animals with the chemical building blocks we need, that glucose, okay? Glucose provides energy to our cells. So the question then is, how is the food we put into our mouth converted to energy that our body can use? It's going to start with glycolysis. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis is only going to give us a small amount of energy. And basically, you're looking at the word glycolysis, you are breaking, to lyse is to break, you're breaking glucose. So glycolysis is the process in which one molecule of glucose is broken in half, producing this pyruvic acid. Okay, so for glycolysis, what goes in is glucose, what comes out is pyruvic acid. Okay, this makes only 2 ATP. It does take a little bit of energy to get the process started. You get 4 ATP out of it, so you are making a little bit of energy with glycolysis. This is what the reaction looks like. Like I said, you put glucose in, it breaks it in half, it breaks it down a little bit more, and we get pyruvic acid. I want you to see that here it takes 2 ATP to break it in half, but we get another 2 ATP out of each side, so you get 4 ATP total down here. And we're also doing another electron carrier. In plants, we used NADP+. In animal cells, we use NAD+. It's still an electron carrier, it's the same thing. So, just like I said, NAD+ is an electron carrier, just like the NADP+ in plants. Glycolysis happens very quickly. It does not require oxygen, but you know that you have to breathe all the time. Your body requires oxygen. So what happens is your body is using oxygen to head to the Krebs cycle. Okay, so this is another shot of glycolysis. Remember, glucose goes in. We make pyruvic acid. We produce 2 ATP total, because remember we had to put 2 ATP in, and we get these electron carriers. The NAD plus turns into NADH. The Krebs cycle is also called the citric acid cycle. Okay, so at the end of glycolysis in this pyruvic acid, we still have about 90% of the chemical energy that we started with. Okay, oops, sorry about that. At the end of glycolysis, we made pyruvic acid, which would goes in this blank space. Okay, if oxygen is present, then this pyruvic acid goes into the Krebs cycle, which happens in the mitochondria. During the Krebs cycle, that pyruvic acid is further broken down into carbon dioxide. We also get 2 more molecules of ATP, and we get all of these electron carriers filling up, NADH and FADH2. These are both electron carriers, just like the NADPH. So for your Krebs cycle, you have to know that pyruvate comes in, carbon dioxide comes out. Okay, you get carbon dioxide here, and down here, and down here. And we get all of these electron carriers filled up, the NAD, the FADH2, the NADH. So we're filling up all of these electron carriers, and we're spitting out carbon dioxide, okay? Again, you don't need to know all of the small little steps in here. You just need to know pyruvate comes in, carbon dioxide comes out, and we fill up a bunch of these electron carriers. The reason we have to fill up all of these electron carriers is the main ATP producing part of cellular respiration is this electron transport chain. It's going to use all of those electrons we've collected in NADH and FADH2 to make ATP. This is how it happens. In your mitochondria has a double membrane, just like your chloroplasts, okay? So here we see this intermembrane space. This is the space between the two membranes. This right here, the matrix, is the inside of your mitochondria. So we're focusing on this inner membrane, okay? This is the membrane that's inside the mitochondria, okay? What happens is we have this phospholipid bilayer just like in your cells, so you can see the little phospholipid head and tails, okay? And there's all of these proteins that line up through that membrane. These proteins pump hydrogen across as these electrons move through them, okay? So the FADH2 and your NADH provide these electrons, and as these electrons travel through these proteins, it's pumping hydrogens into the space between the two membranes. Once we build up that gradient, now we have a high concentration of hydrogens on this side and a low concentration of hydrogens on this side. We get to our ATP synthase. And through facilitated diffusion, we move these hydrogens back inside the mitochondria. And remember, your ATP synthase makes ATP. This electron transport chain is the main producer of ATP. It produces 32 ATP. So with the 2 ATP produced in glycolysis, the 2 ATP produced in the Krebs cycle, and the 32 produced by the electron transport chain, cellular respiration puts out a total of 36 ATP. Here's the formula for cellular respiration. You put glucose, this is the chemical formula for glucose, in. You mix it with oxygen, you put out carbon dioxide, water, and that ATP energy. This is a summary diagram of what this looks like. So you have your glucose, it's broken down by glycolysis, we make a little ATP. We also get those electron carriers filled up to take it to the electron transport chain. The broken down pyruvic acid, also called pyruvate, moves on to the Krebs cycle, which happens in the mitochondria. The Krebs cycle puts out a little bit of ATP. It also puts out that carbon dioxide. It also fills up more electron carriers. All of these electrons and this electron carriers goes to the electron transport chain. That electron transport chain makes all of those ATP. We're going to go into fermentation in our next video.